One of the most underrated conversations that you can have when it comes to animation is workflow. It's one of my favorite things to discuss. It's one of my favorite things to learn about, and any chance I get to find another animator's workflow, see how they work, it's different for everybody. And that's a good thing. There are two main reasons I want to talk about this today. Number one, there's just, like I said, there's a million ways to do something, and animation is such a creative medium that you should never feel stifled or put in a box like, oh, this is the way to animate. There's so many different options. So I want to talk about some of them because a lot of the questions that you and I have both had, how long should this take? You know, when should I switch to spline? Why is this looking like this? Is there a better way? All that kind of stuff. Workflow is super helpful in kind of deciphering that puzzle, that mystery. The other thing are the horror stories. I keep hearing these horrible, horrible stories about people who are spending tons of money to go to colleges, usually not the online animation schools, they're going to regular universities or colleges, private and public, and they're either not being taught anything about workflow. I was talking to somebody recently on my Patreon who I'm mentoring, and I was explaining, do you do kind of a pose to pose, or do you do maybe more straight ahead, something like that? And she didn't know what I was talking about. And that's not her fault, because she's paid for this school to show her all this stuff, and they failed. They've also been putting students in a box and saying, no, this is the way you have to animate. This is how you do it. Like, it needs to look like this. No, absolutely not. That's just, if your school experience sounds like that, run, leave, get out. Don't listen to that. There are so many different ways to do things. So I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about 7 or 8 different workflows that I learned about in school, I've used, I've seen other animators employ, and just kind of show you some options that are out there. And hopefully this will help you in your next shot when you're working on something to go, oh, that would have been so much easier, or oh, I didn't know I could do it that way. That makes way more sense with the way I work or the way I learned. So let's list them out. The workflows I'm going to talk about today, and some of these are going to be different than you think. That's probably because they're my names that I gave them, and they may go by other names to other people. The names don't matter. The process is what we care about. And by the way, if you want to see some of these different workflows in action and see how they're different, I'm going to be doing some demos on Twitch. I'm live twice a week on Twitch, link below. So pose to pose is one of the most common animation workflows. You've probably heard of it, but if you haven't, no worries. Generally, the focus is on individual poses throughout your shot, finding your key poses. For all these workflows, I'm going to have to make up imaginary shots to kind of show you what that workflow would look like if we were animating this. So for pose to pose, let's imagine there's a character, they're standing there, they're gonna receive something, they get a put in their hand, they look, they react, and they wanna get rid of it. This is where in a pose to pose workflow, often thumbnailing comes into play. Now, I have a video on do you need drawing skills to be an animator? Watch that video. It's a great video. It's one of my favorites that I've made. I put a lot of work into it, and it should hopefully be helpful. But I'm gonna start off with some thumbnailing, just kind of roughing out some ideas with writing it down, because it's faster to draw it than it is to pose it. So you kind of have a story here, but the focus is on the poses. These are your main key poses. You've got the initial starting frame, character waiting, we have the receiving, the reaction, and the discarding. Those are the 4 key poses, golden poses, storytelling poses. There's a lot of different words you've probably heard to describe what these are. They're the main things that you would block out to say, this is my story, you can watch it in stepped, and you can kind of get the gist of it. So a pose-to-pose animator in 3D would start by blocking these main poses out, and then you kind of figure out everything in between. How do you get from place to place? This workflow usually focuses on pose appeal, making sure that things are really pushed, focusing on contrast, line of action. So if you're looking at the line of action of this shot, you basically have a character who is straight up and down, then they lean forward and you have kind of an inverted C curve as they look at it. It reverses the other direction to show contrast, a big change of emotion and therefore of everything else. And then in this case, another type of reversal, so that you kind of have these different moments. One of the things that you'll see often in a lot of student work that you want to avoid is the character is kind of always just standing straight up and down the whole way through, and there's never any contrast, and you don't use all the extra screen space that you have available to you, versus if you have to move through the space, it's more dynamic. I will want to talk about this in future episodes. We'll get more in depth on common mistakes and workflow stuff. That's all stuff I want to do, but today we're talking about workflow. And the focus on these poses is obviously why pose to pose is so popular, because with just 4 simple poses and pushing them and trying to make sure that everything reads properly and it's clear, if this is clear, chances are your animation will be clear. It's just a matter of finding the way to interpolate from these poses in a believable and appealing way. Let me give you one more quick example that I'm going to use to contrast with straight ahead in a second. Here's a character who is kind of just sitting, perched, they're waiting. Let's go with some kind of Assassin's Creed type thing. They jump land on the person and then, go to punch the person. Or, in Assassin's Creed, it's much worse than that, but you get the idea. These roughly tell the story of what we're trying to achieve. So therefore, these are our main storytelling golden key poses that we're gonna wanna block in first to make sure that everything reads properly. A good thing about this workflow is that if you can make sure that these poses are all clear and readable and you put them in your animation, you have a good chance of making sure that everything's gonna work out. The downside to this is that you have no concept of timing. Timing is one of the trickiest things to nail in a shot, and it's one of the most important. Because obviously, you could do this frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, and of course it's gonna go by in like 6 frames. Obviously that's not gonna work. But you can't make it like even, you can be like 1, 10, 20, because that's just gonna be floaty and boring, and it's just gonna kind of, the computer's just gonna interpolate smoothly from all these different, it's gonna be really wishy-washy. So the timing is where you take these poses, you make sure they're really strong, and then you figure out where you hold and how you break down and how you interpolate, anticipate, overshoot beyond them. That's like all the rest of animation comes next. And as you keep working, you're gonna be adding more and more keys, because maybe you start out by blocking these first 6 poses, and you're like, cool, now what? Well, you look for the other poses, like what else is missing? What do you need? Well, you don't have anticipations, you don't have overshoot, so then let's talk about that. You're gonna need a frame where the character kind of squashes down, right? They squash down as an anticipation. We need our squash, we need our stretch. We need the character to anticipate the jump, actually physically jump, then they can fly through the air. But the point is that you're going to have to kind of fill in some of these gaps between things. You can't just let the computer go from one to another. So you have to figure out, okay, well, if there's not a clear pose between this and this, you have to think about, okay, well, what connects first? Do you want the character landing with their feet on the person to get all that force and just push them down on the ground? Are they like diving off and they're like grabbing their neck? That's the first connection. Is it the hands that land first? Is it the feet that land first? Are they landing like belly flopping on the person? These are things you get to think about to decide what happens in between these moments. This is the downside to this workflow. Not really a downside, it's the thing to watch out for, is you don't want it to feel like you have the entire body keyed on all these frames, so that everything starts and stops at the same time on the same frames, and it feels like you're hitting poses throughout your animation. You don't want it to feel like that. You want it to feel organic and broken up, and to hide the fact that you did this. The workflow that you use should not be obvious to someone watching your shot. You want them focused on your shot, not on how you got there. Now the next method straight ahead is the easiest way to think about it is think about how a stop motion animator has to work. Now stop motion animators, from how I understand it, they can do a lot of planning, and they kind of animate their shots ahead of time to do a test run, make sure they kind of know what's going on, because you just have to put everything in all at once, which to me is super intimidating. Stop motion animators, you guys are crazy. The straight ahead workflow is probably the closest thing to what they're using, where you start at the beginning and you animate all the stuff going forward until you hit the end of your shot. Now in CG, we have the luxury of kind of coming back in passes and adding more stuff to it, but we'll get to that in a second. So let's say you're animating a running jump and you're gonna do a straight ahead workflow with this character doing that. So here's what I would do. You put your initial poses, and obviously with a pose to pose, we know how we would have done it. We would have kind of tried to find those main key poses, put them in, block them in, and so on. But with straight ahead, we're gonna do it differently. Basically what you're doing is you're starting at the beginning and you're trying to put in all the motion as you go. You're going straight ahead. You have the person plant their foot, then they kind of drop their body weight and that foot has to absorb all that weight. They start to anticipate the jump. They kind of throw all the momentum that they have. The leg starts to rise up. They swing all that forward. That happens kind of here-ish, and they throw it, and then they jump at the same time, trying to push all the momentum off the ground at the same time. They release off the ground, everything has to kind of catch up. They bunch up in the air, and they start preparing for landing. Hopefully you get the idea. Obviously this is not the guide for how to do a running jump necessarily. I'm just kind of drawing stick figures here, but this would be the process of doing straight ahead. Most commonly, this workflow is not done in steps. It's usually done in spline. The straight ahead workflow is usually focused more on motion than on poses. Obviously you're hitting certain poses and you're trying to build that in as you go, but your focus is on the flow of the character and the flow of the motion over time, and that's why you're kind of going through time, putting all that detail in, versus pose to pose. It's focused on those poses and only on those poses. There's two different ways to work, again, and like if there's more to it, like this is different for everybody. Hopefully this is helping though. Next I want to talk about a layered workflow. Now layered is interesting. Layered is not necessarily a workflow by itself. It depends on how you're using it. So layered is usually something that people combine with pose to pose or with straight ahead. It's not always the case, but let me explain what I mean. If you were working on a bouncing ball, I mean, we all understand the basic mechanics of a ball bounce shot. Start here and do the whole thing, right? Dun, 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 dun. We all know how this is supposed to look, but there are lots of different ways to achieve it. Now, if you were to follow the more pose to pose type of workflow, you're probably gonna be focused on this location, this location, this location, this location, this location, right? And then you'll think like, okay, well, in between that as well, we have our, our stretch, squash and stretch, and this is the pose to pose method of doing a ball bounce. The straight ahead method is probably less focused on kind of putting in those tent poles along the way, and instead maybe you open the graph editor and you focus more on the motion. So again, it's pose focused or is it motion focused? How do you like to work? One of these is gonna make more sense to you than the other. So a straight ahead animator, instead of putting those main parts throughout the process, they may be focused on like one bounce at a time. Maybe they're focused on this section. So you're thinking more about your spacing. So maybe you have like these bigger gaps here, like the ball's kind of slower up here, it's got some hang time, and then wham, the spacing gets faster, the distance between each frame gets longer. But here's the thing when it comes to layered. A layered approach allows you to split the job into smaller bite-sized pieces to get it done more efficiently if you're good at that. Not everyone is good at layered because you can't like separate the stuff in your head or in the software. Some people this isn't for everybody. But if this makes sense to you, then let's try this. A ball bounce that's gonna go through and do its whole thing, it's divided into the up and down and the left and right. This is where the graph editor comes really handy into play, and that's kind of how the graph editor works, is it's dividing all the motion in your shot into individual axes into different kinds of motion: translation, rotation, scale in X, Y, and Z. Start here, and I'm gonna animate just the bounce. I'm gonna have it bounce here, and you figure out your timing and your spacing. Now, whether you are pose to pose here, or if you are kind of straight ahead is up to you. The straight ahead animator might be, again, focused on like the spacing as it kind of grows and gets longer, and they're thinking about the motion, where the pose to pose animator says, okay, well, it's gonna be here, and then it's gonna be that, and then it's gonna be that. What happens is you end up with a translation Y or Z if you're in Blender, but the up and down, you end up with a curve representing up and down. At the beginning of your shot is here because the ball's high up in the air. And then a couple frames later, let's just call it frame 5, you have the key at the bottom. Bam, it comes and falls into it. You end up with your up and down curve, which happens to look like a ball bounce. We've talked about this in my graph editor video. Ignore the shape. It's not about like, it looks like a ball bounce. That's not the point. The point is you end up with once you have the up and down perfect, boom, 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 you're done with the bounce. Now all you have to do is add the other layer, the left and the right, and then you combine them. If you just had the ball by itself and you have it lay on the ground and then you just animate, it's very linear and it moves across the screen very evenly until it eventually comes to a stop. The amount of space between each frame gets cut down. I'm doing a bad job of this. However you choose to do it, you can do the translate X component separately. And then when you put the two together, you have the ball following the boom, 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 boom with the motion. And you get boom, 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 and it does all the stuff. That is a much more efficient way to do a ball bounce, if that makes sense to you, because you can probably do one thing at a time faster than trying to manage both. So layered approaches can be really helpful in compartmentalizing the amount of work you have to do and keeping it very manageable and easy to understand. This is very important with things like the arms, for example. Like the arms have all kinds of rotations. So if you're just focusing on the arms at one time and not worrying about the rest of the body, that's how this feeds into bigger shots. Layered approach is usually focusing on just the torso, just the arms, just the legs, just the neck and the head, maybe just like things like that. It's also doing passes, like you could do a face pass, you could do like a lip sync pass, you could do like a brows pass. There's many ways to break it up, but a layered animator in a more complex shot often turns off the stuff that they don't need. They're no longer focused on, the shot as a whole, they're focusing on different sections and they're doing it in layers. And this is compatible with either workflow. Layered isn't for everybody. I, for a really long time, couldn't understand, what do you mean you turn off parts of the body? Why? Because then, don't you need to see the legs to, you don't. If you can do this workflow, it's fine. And if this doesn't make any sense to you and you're like, I don't want to turn things off, then that's okay too. There's many other ways to do it. Next, I want to talk about sketch blocking. And sketch blocking is, if you are a 2D animator, if you're someone who draws, this is probably going to be really great for you. Sketch blocking is interesting. It does require some amount of skill when it comes to 2D animation. Not a lot. You can do a lot with stick figures, or you can go really big. Sketch blocking is the act of basically animating your entire shot ahead of time with a pencil and paper or a stylus or whatever. Kind of like what I've been doing so far, where I'm just kind of drawing it out and then we'd take it to 3D. That's the general idea. But usually it's a little bit more involved than that, where you're figuring out the timing. You are figuring out like what frames everything's happening on, what are the breakdowns. Like you are doing a lot of that animation work up front in the planning process, and you're blocking it all out by sketching it. Because again, it's faster to draw this pose of a character like saluting, I guess, I don't know. It's faster to draw that than it is to pose it. Now, if you're like a great artist and you can actually like figure out like, okay, which way are the hips and the chest like turned, and like how do we want the head to be angled? Maybe they're looking down this way and their hand is, you can get really detailed. You can do it this way. The point is to get all the information in here so that you basically just copy it over to the computer. I've seen some amazing sketch blocking. They literally animated the entire thing in 2D and it looks incredible. So if that's you, you can kind of bypass struggling with the computer, do your animation with drawings, figure out all the stuff you want to have, and then just copy it into your work. You did the work, you animated it, now you just have to transition it into a 3D medium. And for the rest of us who are not that talented, if you're doing any kind of acting piece especially, when you start with a rig in 3D, it comes in just, you know, T-pose, A-pose, super blank expression, just neutral, right? No personality, no expression, nothing. You never want to start with a rig like this. You always want to, you know, add some personality, add some attitude, like make the character not look like they're just like staring into the void. In 2D, even if you just draw basic stuff, like if you just draw a character, you know, who's just like neutral, at the very least, like this character feels like they could just be looking off into space. Like now you have a character who's maybe slightly hunched over, their shoulders are down, and they're just kind of like, that is so much better than, you know, like a character who's just completely blank. And so even if you can't draw all that great, this gives you at least an idea of, you know, what to do with the face. Because let's talk about an expression. If you do a character who's like shocked, it's like, oh my gosh, wow, and their mouth opens and it's, you know, a big thing. In the computer, you could pose it out and just by default, it won't look great. Like if you just kind of open the mouth and do what the rig will just kind of let you start with, you're gonna have to do a lot more work, but you may not be super familiar with that. You're like, okay, well, what kinds of things can I do to push the face? Like how can I push that emotion? You know, I'll see a lot of 3D rigs that are posed kind of like this. It's fine, you get the idea, but it's very basic, it's very symmetrical, everything's just kind of like, it's very generic. But if you were to draw this in 2D, even if like me, you can't draw all that well, I like to doodle cartoons, so hopefully you can see the difference where when you draw it, you can just draw what you think it should probably look like. And it gives you ideas of how to push your 3D, because it's like, okay, well, I drew the mouth in an interesting way. Can we hit that mouth shape? At the very least, like, even if we can't do this little dip in the middle, can I at least see how it's like bigger and taller and like it's smaller here and wider here? At the very least, maybe the mouth shape could look something more like this. Maybe more like kind of flat at the bottom, rounded at the top. It's asymmetrical where you've got kind of a bigger area here, a smaller area here. The tongue's more to the side. The character's kind of looking to the side a little bit. The pupils are smaller, the eyebrows are higher, like the lower lids are being pushed up because the bottom mouth is pushing them up. There's more information. And so sketch blocking on a big scale or on a small scale can be helpful to just kind of rough out ideas again and give yourself more to work with in the computer. Because the computer's not going to help you. Maya, Blender, whatever software, it's not going to help you make anything more appealing, so you've got to rely on the creative stuff, the stuff that's left to people, to humans, like mocap data, AI, they can't do this. And like, who knows, maybe one day they can help us out, but right now, use the tools that you've got, and drawing and sketch blocking is one of those tools. Next up is reference blocking. Reference blocking it's somewhat controversial. It's a very helpful workflow and you want to use it in certain situations, but not in others. Reference blocking is one of those things that like, it kind of like layered combined with either pose to pose or straight ahead, because if you had reference of a character doing things and they're cheering or something, you can kind of go through the reference and pick your key poses and then you know where to start, same as before. Or you can just kind of start at the beginning and more or less like, not rotoscope or rotomate as I call it, but you kind of block out your shot on like every, let's call it every 5 frames, every 4 frames, every 2 frames, every 7 frames, every so often, you're kind of just going to that frame, looking at the reference, and then kind of copying that into your animation and posing the character to match. Reference blocking is the act with the purpose of capturing all the organic detail. This workflow will give you a much more naturalistic type of look. How to Train Your Dragon is an example of a lot of the animation looks more like this.
And you?
Ooh, a fighting spirit, I love it. Only, I'm afraid you're mistaken. You've never seen anything like me.
Anything that looks a little bit more realistic is usually using some form of this workflow, not always, but often, because you act it out, you figure out what you like, and then you look and you're like, oh, I like these little details. I like these little head shakes I'm doing. I like the little things in my fingers I'm adding. And you can pull from all of this. And it makes it really easy because you can just kind of, and it makes it really easy.
You serious?
You know, you have to figure it out. You have to make those choices. The hard part is that you still have to push it. Nobody comes to the theaters. I guess no one comes to the theaters right now at all. No one comes to the theaters to watch Hiccup act like me. Because I don't move all that interesting. I'm not animated. I can't defy physics. But he can ride dragons and he can do all these cool things. So you need to push it. You need to make these stylized characters more stylized motion. So you push the poses. You exaggerate the actions. You go bigger because it's animation and you want it to be appealing and entertaining and fun to watch. Now, again, like that's where this can kind of split because like what if you're doing games and you go for Call of Duty? You don't want the, if say you're animating on Call of Duty, you're probably not pushing poses that much. Maybe you're pushing things for clarity, silhouette, but you're not really trying to make it zany or cartoony. You know, visual effects uses this workflow a lot. You could record reference and then animate really, really close to it, and you'll essentially get what's motion capture data because you'll be capturing all the little details. Like I did that once. My Hiccup shot that I animated, I actually screwed it up once because I over animated it. I rotoscoped the animation from my reference and it looked like mocap data. And it didn't feel right because Hiccup's supposed to move like Hiccup, not like me in a suit or me just from reference. So you can go too far with this. You can also not go far enough because maybe you just copy a few poses and that's all you get. And then you never captured any of that organic stuff. Totally depends. Because are you looking for the cartoony stuff? Are you trying to push your reference and try to make it zany and then kind of just go rogue on it? Or are you trying to make it look like motion capture data? Because that can be helpful. That can be very useful. It entirely depends on the style of the shot that you're animating and what you want out of it. Some animators hate this because it leaves a lot of those decisions up to you in the acting room and therefore not like in your hands as a creative artist as you're in the software. Some people love it because they're really fast. They can block in all the stuff, they can get the main poses, they can get all the organic details, and then they can clear out what they don't need, start deleting stuff, start retiming things, push the timing, push the poses, push the motion, and then you end up with a lot of work really quickly. There's no right or wrong answer. It's completely dependent on what you need. So just know that it's an option for you. Don't ever do this with an animated shot. Like don't ever pull reference from animation. I have videos on how to do reference well, and we talk much more about it. So if you want to talk more about reference, you know, obviously come over to Twitch or watch these videos. They will help a lot. But this is a workflow that you can use to pull a lot of organic detail from your performance and into your animation. So there's an option. Let's keep going. Yo, I'm here from the future where I have a haircut and I'm editing this video and I forgot something very important with reference blocking. I want to add one more kind of part, one more way to use reference. I think the more commonly liked way of using reference that's good is it's about capturing the timing of when things happen and pushing as you go, having the flexibility of capturing all the detail but being able to push and do more with it. And so the way that a lot of people use reference is to bring it in and key the important parts. Oh, hi. Every time, you know, if someone's running around, it's body mechanics. Where are the feet hitting? If someone jumps, where are they leaving the ground? Where are they landing? Where are they like in the middle of their jump, at the apex of the jump? When are the blinks happening? When are the eye darts happening? Things like that. Every important thing that happens in the shot, it's not just about pulling out key poses. I mentioned that with a pose-to-pose workflow, often it's finding the key poses. It's not just that, it's also finding landmarks in your reference, either for pose-to-pose or for straight ahead. You do want to figure out when those things are happening because it's that kind of stuff that's going to help really utilize the reference best. You are pulling the weight and the realism and the timing from real life into your animation, and then you're exaggerating either how big those actions are, or you can push the timing of when those actions happen. But you need to first find them all to see what you're looking at and to see the rhythm of your shot through where those keys fall. So I just wanted to add that one more piece. That's a good way to use reference in your workflow. All right, now on to the next one. Extremes is something that like, I don't know a good name for it. I learned this workflow from an animator at DreamWorks. It blew my mind and it was weird, but it seems really cool and can be really effective if you can think this way. It's kind of like layered, but on another level. Let's say you record reference and you've got all this acting, all this great stuff, and you wanna capture it and you wanna push it, and you don't wanna like get all the data, you don't wanna get all the organic stuff, you just wanna get like the main, body stuff and kind of that organic motion where things don't feel pose to pose. You want it to feel all broken up and nice, so what do? In extreme, it's not because it's so extreme, like, it's crazy. I just don't know what else to call it. What you're doing is you're looking for the extremes in each axis of motion. If I go like this, and I move my body just over to the left and back over here, what you have is you have an X, a Y, and a Z in translation, rotation, and scale. Now, I'm not really scaling, so we're gonna ignore that one. I am rotating, but we're gonna not focus on it for a second. We're just gonna think about translation. If I go like this, there's a left and a right component. Same with the ball bounce, right? You can do the up and down, you can do the left and right, put them together, you get the bounce. Same thing here. You just split everything and you look for, there's a lot of motions, a lot going on. It's much more complex than a ball bounce. So you say, okay, what's the most extreme left I ever get? You put a key on the X. What's the most extreme right I ever get? It's on this frame, it's about this far. All right, let's put that in on this frame, this far. The computer's gonna do a pretty, smooth curve, but you have to look and say, okay, how do you get from each extreme? Now, this workflow is usually, you turn off everything. You turn off everything except the thing you're working on. So it's just the torso, like literally just the hips, and you're only looking at the X and the Y. And you figure out, okay, where's the minimum? Where's the maximum? Those are the extremes. Okay, at what time did the midpoint happen? Did I go really quick and then ease? Did I slowly go and then go really fast? That's gonna determine like, okay, well, you then get to figure all that out. You do that for the X, you do that for the Y, you do that for the Z, which is why some of my reference tips are really helpful for recording all that data, all that information for yourself. You just do the X, Y, and Z. Then you do it for rotation. X, Y, Z, all the same stuff. And then you do it for the next part of the body and the next part of the body. And it's this really kind of granular, weird process where you're just doing little bits at a time in very specific ways. And for a long time, your shot's gonna look weird and just wrong. But eventually, once you've added it all in there, you basically, and you can push it as you go. Because if you say like, I wanna go to the right, whoosh, not enough, like let's push it higher. Let's go really to the right, whoosh. Then you can push your animation. Like this is a way that you can you can do it pose to pose, because again, you can just there's so many ways to do all this stuff. It's almost overwhelming to try and explain it all in a video, but hopefully you're getting the gist of what extremes does. You split translation, rotation, scale, X, Y, Z on every body part, on every major body part. You don't want to put keys on everything. You're no longer putting all your keys on your main key poses. You're now focused on each part of the body's motion. So you might have the arm keyed here, and keyed there, but then you have the leg keyed here, there, and then maybe another key over here. The torso's keyed here, and here. You end up with keys all over your timeline. It's extremely messy. So if that freaks you out, then just know that. But you don't run into the situation where you have a key on this, a key on this, a key on this, and it feels pose to pose because all three poses, bam, 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 bum, 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 bum. It doesn't feel like, your keys are pose to pose, where then you have to kind of go in and add the other stuff here to make it feel broken up later. The extremes method kind of starts off with a minimal approach across the whole timeline with a lot of organics broken up, and you have to stay organized because your timeline will not be. It's a really cool workflow. If it makes no sense to you and you're like, what the heck are you trying to say? We'll do a demo sometime, don't worry about it. But if you're like, whoa, that sounds great, try it, see if it works for you. Last but not least, I wanna talk about key categories. This is another dumb name I came up with. I don't know what you would actually call this. But to come back to this example, remember how earlier we kind of had the poses. We had like the main key poses, and I mentioned how you need to also add anticipations and things like that. The key categories workflow, I'm sure there's a better name for this. It's where you go through your shot, and whether you're using reference, whether you're using drawings, whether you're just kind of winging it, regardless, the point of this one is to make sure that you don't miss anything with your blocking. Just pro tip, one of the things that when you're like, when do I go from splined or step to spline, if you're doing that workflow, it's like when you have enough keys. Blocking is all about getting enough information and the timing in there. So when it comes to key categories, you have your key poses, your golden poses, your storytelling poses, your main, right? Like the things that pose to pose is focused on. You have those. We're just gonna call them your main keys. Anticipations, antics, overlap, or follow through. Basically, anytime something overshoots and has to come back, because sometimes you have motion go, whoa, and it comes back over. So you have key pose and you have key pose. But you might have key, anticipation, overshoot, and then key. One thing missing, breakdown. There may be more, but these are kind of the main 4 components to key categories, and you have to assign everything to these 4 things. You have your main key and anticipation. The breakdown happens in between, where it's like, are we going down and up? Are we going over and down? Are we going just straight across? Am I gonna like do something weird in the middle? Break down that motion. That's a big jump from like the anticipation to, let's call it the overshoot, or maybe you just kind of go key, anticipation, and you do your breakdown somewhere in the middle, and then you just kind of ease into your key. Maybe you don't have an overshoot or a follow through. That might not be a thing, like that's optional. Anticipations are also sort of optional. Like you could just go and like go really fast. If you're doing games and a character has to jump, they might just jump on the frame that the player pushes the button. There's no time for a whole wind up because you want the game to feel responsive. Totally depends. These 2 are somewhat optional, but for most people watching, they're not. Just figure out where they fall. And so when you're blocking out your animation, you have, you know, your main keys, golden pose or something, I don't know, storytelling pose, whatever they are, all the stuff, it's all the same. You could do pose to pose where, again, you're focusing on these main things. And then you do the poses for anticipations. We're on our key, and then we anticipate. And then maybe here, yeah, like maybe we do go like follow through and then back to the key. So then that's our overlap. And then you need a breakdown in between the 2 because you got to figure out how are you going to get from there? Are you going over or going under? And then you have your other key. And then maybe you hold that for a while. And so, oh, I should do that. That's another one. Sorry, I forgot one. Hold. Where it's very close, where you don't actually want motion. Like maybe you have the character go here, anticipate, breakdown, overshoot, and key. And then they kind of hold it in place for a bit, and then they move again, because it shouldn't just go here and then drift away and drift over here, and there's just constant motion all the time. It'd be exhausting. You need to have holds. It needs to kind of get somewhere and stay there. Act in the pose. Give the audience time to breathe, and then do the next action. Totally depends on your shot, but these are kind of your 5 things. Your main key, your anticipation, your overlap follow through, your breakdowns, and your holds. There's not a set rule on like how they work, but hopefully this gives you an idea. This is the way where pose to pose, it's almost like layered for pose to pose. I mean, layered is just splitting things into different pieces where you're focusing on the motion. Kind of like how straight ahead you're focused on motion. Where this, key categories, this is almost like pose to pose in a layered way, sort of thing, where like you're splitting your keys into layers. You have like a layer of your main keys, and then you do a layer of your anticipations, and a layer of your overlaps, and so on. That's why like some of these aren't standalone workflows, or sometimes they are, or you see them combined, sometimes you don't do it this way. Like, there's a million ways to do this. There's so many different ways to animate any shot, and you probably will not use the same workflow on every shot. Most people don't. I don't know a single animator who like never changes their workflow. Different problems require different solutions, sort of thing, right? Hopefully this video kind of arms you with some knowledge of like, oh, like there's a lot of ways to do it. Maybe you got some ideas, maybe you got some different like thoughts of how you could tackle a shot, but really think about it. Like, try different things. The only way to know what's right for you is to give it a shot. You'll try one, maybe it doesn't work at all. Maybe you tweak it, maybe it's great. Or maybe you just stay away from that method because that's just not how your brain works and you go over here. There's never a right way or a wrong way, and don't let anyone tell you that you have to animate a certain way unless you're doing like dumb stuff and your mentor's trying to look out for you and be like, oh, maybe don't do that. That's a bad habit or something. But especially if you like pay for a school, like if you pay like thousands of dollars to go to some school and they're like, everyone has to follow this workflow. Why? Like, people do all kinds of different things at all kinds of different studios. And sometimes there are reasons to have a specific one for a certain show, absolutely. But use your judgment, you know? So yeah, hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, I'll be live on Twitch. This week we're doing some demos, so you know, link for that. This all came from a conversation I had with someone in my Patreon mentorship program. So if you want to have some more like direct questions or stuff like that, like check out my Patreon. We have a lot of cool stuff there. And I think that's it. Follow all the other socials while you're at it. Give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. All that YouTube stuff. But thanks for watching, and I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. If you have other workflows we should talk about, what kind of demos you want to see. I want to do more on this topic. So with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.